Good day. I have with me Professor Amanda Gous of the University of Stellenbosch. And as you should have heard in the conversation I had with Rikus Delport of the University of Pretoria, the university is busy with a process creating a space of awareness about gender, and specifically people that want to identify as gender neutral, gender fluid. There's a whole lot of other descriptions as well. And most of us don't really know what this all means. And we have a knee-jerk reaction when it comes to it. So I decided to speak to Professor Gous and try to shed some light on some of the points that we don't understand. Good afternoon, Amanda.
Good afternoon, Isak, and thank you for the opportunity.
And as I've said, here we sit. Most of us, if we have to admit it, don't really understand what's happening here.
Well, I think what you've referred to, the knee-jerk reaction, is very often people think that this is about political correctness. And so we all have to use certain terminology, even though we may not understand it or may not agree with it. But if we talk about gender non-conformity, it means that people do not conform to the most often used binary construction of gender as male and female, or men and women. It means that non-conformity, that you don't conform to that binary construction. And so we talk about LGBTIQ, so lesbian, gay, intersex, transsexual, and queer. And those are all types of gender identities that does not really fit on that binary construction. And we also talk about heteronormativity, which means that most often when we think about gender relationships, we think about them as between men and women in heterosexual relationships. And when we talk about gender fluidity, it means that people do not see themselves as part of that binary construction that's also heteronormative. So if we talk about lesbian and gay, that's a sexual identity that people have same-sex attractions to each other. Intersex means that those are people born with anomalous genitalia or a chromosomal structure or hormonal structure, and they can very often decide for themselves what they want to be. So it's not an imposed identity. Transsexuality means that people believe that they are not, that they are in a body that they do not think that they should be in, so that they very often will sort of relate to the opposite sex, or want to be in the body of somebody who is in the opposite sex. And therefore, some people have what we call gender reassignment surgery, which means that they change their sexual identity, or in terms of the anatomy and biology, it is then changed through a medical intervention. So it's a whole spectrum of identities. But I think the important thing is that we need to understand that the world is not, relationships among genders are fluid, and that it does not only conform to what we see as heterosexual relationships, and that gender is a construction. So that means that very often it's constructed around what people see as a role definition. So men are the breadwinners, women are the caregivers, and they sort of do the homemaking and caring work and so on, which are really outdated ideas. But very often, if we look at how things operate in the workplace or in relationships, the people still adhere to those role identities. But with a sort of change in these roles, and also people, I think there's much more scope now for people to be honest and open about their sexual identities and their sexual attractions. We've moved away from that binary construction to more what we call fluid gender identities. And I think the important thing is that people should respect that. Whether you agree with it, whether you don't understand it, the most important issue is that you respect people's choices, and that it is about choice. And everybody has the right to make choices regarding their sexual identities and sexual orientations.
Amanda, in a world where we are used to binary, it is easy to understand, or one should try and understand why it's difficult for people, even if they are religious or not. Some people find it difficult to move away from that. How do you explain something like gender fluidity to them?
Well, I think why people are fundamentally uncomfortable with that is because it really challenges the way that that society works, or how people see society work and should work, right? It challenges the nuclear family. It challenges the idea of a mother, father, and children in a heterosexual relationship. So it challenges very deep beliefs that people have, and that's why they struggle. And I think, you know, it may be very difficult to explain it to people who are actually quite religious. I think religion play an important role in how people view homosexuality, how they view transgender, and so on. But it brings me back to the issue of respect and the fact that these rights are actually constitutionally protected. That's why, for example, gay people now can get married, because we had to implement that obligation that's in the Constitution through legislation. I think that, you know, homophobia or transphobia and so on is something that people need to actually start to think about. How do I relate to people that's not part of that gender binary? And I think very often, you know, homophobia also results in violence. We know that a lot of lesbian women are killed because they are viewed as challenging men's authority in society. So I think we need to understand the constitutional protection that people have, people of different genders, people of, you know, who make different choices. And you know, it's not something that you can actually force people to accept. But I think the issue of self-reflexivity is very important, to reflect upon the fact that people have choices, and those choices may not be the choices you would necessarily make. But, you know, to resort to homophobia or homophobic violence, I think is really hugely problematic. Well, I think that, you know, there's, like I say, more space for people to be open about their choices now. But even so, you have to reflect on how do you talk about other groups of people? What do you call gay women and what do you call gay men? You know, there's a lot of derogative terms in English and Afrikaans for people like that. So do you use those terms? Do you make really lewd jokes about people who are gay or who are transgender or so on? You know, if that is the case, clearly there's a lack of respect towards these choices. And I think this is what people should reflect upon, is that their own attitudes towards people who are different, because this is also about difference, right? People who are not like us. So it is what we say, the other. And we can think of that in terms of race. So, you know, how do we, if you white, speak about black people, or if you black, speak about white people? You know, is it in terms of using the derogatory terms? And how is it that we've changed attitudes about race? I think we've made some progress in South Africa. So it's the same thing. We had to change attitudes about race. Now we are going to change attitudes about gender.
There's also the question of addressing someone of a certain choice. I don't want to make a specific choice now, but just to explain it as an example. I know gender neutral people have specific terms that they prefer to be addressed as. What are these terms, and why is that important?
Well, sometimes people do not want to be addressed as he or she because they are fluid somewhere in between. So they often use the plural to say they. And that's, that's non-gendered. It's also, or what you say, gender neutral. In 2016, the students started writing women with an X. Where the A is, there's an X. And that's the idea that, the man in women it refers to a man, and that we shouldn't actually buy into that idea. So those are quite radical ideas, I think, and people who are not used to hearing this find it quite radical. I think the interesting thing is when you meet someone who is quite androgynous and you cannot tell whether it's a man or a woman, people become very confused. They become disoriented. They don't know how to address that person. And I think this is the point that people are trying to make is, what does it matter, right? You don't have to use he or she. You can use, like I said, they or something else. People will probably tell you how they want to be addressed. So it's also about the power that resides in language and how we speak about and to other people.
Just to thank you very much for talking to us. Create a sense of appreciation or understanding where for the person that doesn't understand, where does this originate from? For someone that's used to think in binary terms, how do you explain where this that's so new to him or her comes from?
Well, it's actually not new. Homosexuality has been with us throughout the ages, right? But because it was always frowned upon, people just remain silent, or like we say, used to be in the closet, are now more open about their choices. So we have to think about past suppression of identities and of people's choices. So what is now viewed as new is actually quite not new at all. It's just about greater freedom to exercise those choices. And if people think about this as new, it's because they are now confronted with something that's different, that they were in the past not confronted with because it was secret and hidden and people did not talk about their choices. And I think this is also part of, young people who are actually quite threatened and fear this sort of idea of difference. They should ask themselves, why is it that this is something that occurred to them as new when it's actually not been new at all?
That's Professor Amanda Gous that was talking to us. Amanda, I suppose it's a question of live and let live and creating respect to each other.
Well, yeah, I mean, what you're saying now, it's about tolerance, but I also think tolerance does not mean acceptance. And at some point, merely to tolerate people maybe not good enough. We have to move on to acceptance.